The date is November 18, 1903, and Panama's president Manuel Amador is on his way to Washington. Panama has just won its independence from Colombia with the aid of Roosevelt's navy. As the train pulls into Union Station, Amador is completely unaware that his ally, the United States, has just betrayed him. He is greeted by his minister plenipotentiary, a Frenchman by the name of Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a conniving, sophisticated conman whose elaborate years-long scheme has just entered its final stage. "I have just signed the Canal Treaty," he tells Amador. "The Republic of Panama is henceforth under the protection of the United States." So why on earth is a Frenchman signing treaties on behalf of the Republic of Panama? And what does it mean to be under the protection of the United States? Well, it's an inconceivable story. In fact, it's one of the most incredible stories I have ever heard, and I can't wait to tell you all about it. Welcome back to the channel, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Barrel Boy Travels. As you can probably tell, this video is going to be a little different. Earlier this year, we visited Panama City, and I became obsessed with the history of Panama. History that I never learned in school, and that I'm willing to bet you haven't either. This video is the culmination of months of research, but I may well have gotten a few things wrong along the way. If I do, please don't be shy. Let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, why not hit the like button and subscribe to follow more travel and history content like this. With that out of the way, when people think of Panama, they usually think of the canal, and that is a huge part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The characters in the story of Panama are mostly villains, conquistadors, pirates, backstabbing diplomats, and even, frankly, presidents, who did some unthinkable things, but in the process, their ambition completely changed the world. Our story begins centuries before the canal, in the year 1500, when a European explorer named Vasco Núñez de Balboa arrived in the New World as part of an expedition in search of gold. But Balboa would end up discovering something far more valuable. After 5 years exploring Panama and the northern tip of what's now known as South America, Balboa made enough money to settle down on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola and start a pig farm. Yep, Balboa, the guy they'd later name the currency after, was a pig farmer. But as it turns out, he wasn't a very good pig farmer. He wound up getting himself into a lot of debt, and he was eventually forced to flee the island to escape his creditors. He stowed away aboard a ship headed back to Panama, hiding inside a barrel along with his pet dog. Now, I love my dog, but I don't really want to be locked inside a barrel with him. Balboa quickly gained popularity with the crew, so much so in fact that the crew eventually mutinied and installed him as the new leader. But popular does not mean nice. Balboa was actually a pretty horrible guy. When he wasn't busy torturing and enslaving the natives, Balboa was on the hunt for gold and on the lookout for this South Sea he had heard rumors about. What Balboa didn't know at the time, what no European knew at the time, was that the ground he was standing on was an isthmus, a narrow strip of land that divides two large bodies of water from one another. And the Panamanian Isthmus is a very special one because it divides the Atlantic Ocean on one side from the Pacific Ocean on the other. At its narrowest expanse, it's just 37 miles across, or 60 kilometers, and it's at this narrowest expanse where the Panama Canal will eventually be built, connecting the port city of Colón on the Atlantic end to modern-day Panama City on the other. Again, Balboa knows none of this. But on one fateful day in 1513, he was guided by a group of natives to the summit of a tall mountain. When he reached the top, he fell to his knees and wept. Far away on the horizon, he glimpsed for the first time the waters of his undiscovered sea. Balboa had become the first European to ever gaze upon the Pacific Ocean. Overcome by emotion, he sent a ship to Spain to tell them the great news of this incredible discovery, and Spain responded by replacing him. As the gold rush gained momentum, the population of Panama swelled and the economy boomed, but this attracted a new threat. The English monarchy had long encouraged and even profited from piracy against their rivals. In the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I began providing explicit commissions or letters of marque, which authorized privateers to attack Spanish towns and ships whenever England and Spain were at war, which, well, happened quite a bit. In 1596, Sir Francis Drake, acting with permission from the English crown, sacked and torched the Spanish city of Nombre de Dios, located on the Atlantic coast of Panama near modern-day Colón. Now, it was one thing to attack a city on the Atlantic coast, but getting to Panama City was a totally different story. One option was to sail all the way down to the southernmost tip of South America, cross the recently discovered Strait of Magellan, and then head back up the coast, which is, well, quite the ordeal. If you didn't want to do all that, you could instead try to get there via the Chagres River, but this is a lot harder than it looks. The mouth of the Chagres was protected by the fortress of San Lorenzo, a stone castle armed with 20 cannons and defended by a garrison of 300 men. There was no way to sneak past, so you'd have to somehow conquer the fort. From there, it's a perilous 5-day journey along the Chagres River to reach the village of Cruces. Fight off the Spanish forces there, and now you'd still have miles of dense jungle ahead of you, teeming with disease, poisonous snakes, and treacherous terrain. And of course, you'd have to navigate this final stretch on foot and somehow arrive with enough men to actually be able to capture the city. You'd have to be completely out of your mind. But well, let me introduce you to Henry Morgan. It's hard to say if Henry Morgan was brilliant or just plain lucky, but he was definitely lucky. Let's start with the time that his ship exploded in a freak accident, killing 200 men on board and hurling him into the ocean. Miraculously, he survived. One of Morgan's most notable raids took place at the city of Portobello. 3 castles protected the city, 2 in the harbor and 1 in the city itself. To sneak past their defenses, Morgan loaded his men into canoes, and then they attacked, conquering one castle, then another, then another. The Spanish sent a force of 800 men to try and reconquer it, but Morgan prevailed, and Spain wound up paying him 100,000 pesos just to leave. Then, in 1671, Morgan and his men did the unthinkable. They sailed to Fort Lorenzo, conquered it, and then miraculously survived the 8-day journey across the Isthmus of Panama with minimal provisions. When they arrived at the gates of Panama City, they were starving, outnumbered, and facing a superior force of 1,200 men. But once again, Morgan got lucky. The Spanish had concocted a plan to release cattle at just the right moment to trample Morgan's men as they advanced, but it backfired. The cattle were terrified of gunfire and ended up trampling the Spanish soldiers instead. The Spanish retreated and Morgan sacked the city. But after the city was burned to the ground, Morgan found himself in quite a bit of trouble. You see, a year earlier, the Spanish and the English had actually entered into a peace treaty. Remember how I said that privateers only had permission to attack Spanish towns when the English were at war with them? Yeah, this was not good. Hoping to avoid a diplomatic crisis, King Charles II ordered Morgan's arrest. Fearless as ever, Morgan returned to England and claimed ignorance, saying that he had no knowledge of the treaty. And well, things just have a way of working out for Henry Morgan. Or should I say, Sir Henry Morgan. That's right, instead of sending him to jail, Charles instead knighted him and installed him as the Deputy Governor of Jamaica? Go figure. The ruins of the original European settlement are a place we managed to visit during our time in Panama City. Welcome to Panama Viejo, or Old Panama. Despite the fire and years of abandonment, many buildings, such as this large convent for nuns, are surprisingly well preserved. All that remains of the cathedral, however, is this bell tower, which was also used as a strategic lookout. Not that it did them that much good. At the time of Morgan's attack, there were about 10,000 people living in the city, and it's not really known how many died during the attack, but certainly thousands. In the aftermath, the inhabitants sifted through the rubble and came up with a plan to rebuild. They decided to resettle on a new location a few kilometers northwest of the original city. an isolated peninsula which could be easily defended by a system of walls. While this was the new city when it was first built, today this is known as Casco Viejo, or the Old Quarter, and it is the tourist hotspot. Nestled in the midst of its old-world colonial charm are many amazing restaurants and bars. Casco Viejo is also brimming with history. Every single event I'm going to talk about next has a street or plaza here named for it. Plaza Simón Bolívar commemorates Panama's independence from Spain. The French Plaza honors the casualties of the disastrous French Canal project, and Independence Square commemorates Panama's independence from Colombia, which wasn't exactly cut and dry. Independence Square is also where you'll find the Canal Museum, which provides a phenomenal in-depth treatment of the history of that most audacious infrastructure project that came to define the nation. The dream of building a canal goes all the way back to Balboa. Remember him? Right before he got his head chopped off, that report he sent to Spain mused about the possibility of building a canal to connect the two oceans, and folks in Spain loved the idea. One priest wrote to the king that, if there are mountains, there are also hands. To a king of Spain, what is possible is easy. Wow, that's some hubris there. At any rate, Charles was persuaded, and he commissioned an initial engineering survey with the goal of eventually building a canal, but the project would be rather short-lived. In 1556, Charles was forced by his declining health to abdicate the Spanish crown in favor of his son, Philip II. Philip, also known as Philip the Prudent, was something of a fanatical Christian. He viewed the construction of a canal as unnatural and against God's law. Spain would never take up the canal project again. But in 1821, everything changed when Panama declared its independence. The ensuing revolution, if you want to call it that, was completely bloodless. Like, surely someone stubbed a toe or something, but there were no documented casualties. You see, Spain already had its hands full, fighting Simón Bolívar in South America, and so they just sort of let the whole Panama thing happen. Fearing that Spain might eventually retaliate, however, Panama did decide to go ahead and join Bolívar's burgeoning republic, known at that time as Gran Colombia. And after joining Colombia, life in Panama began to change rapidly. In 1846, the United States received permission to build a railway across the Isthmus of Panama. But why on earth would the US want to build a railway in Panama? Well, you see, Americans were flocking to the West Coast in droves, and the journey was not an easy one. Ever played the Oregon Trail? Then yeah, you get what I'm talking about. The Panama Railway presented a weird alternative. Passengers could now board a ship in New York, take it to Cologne Harbor, and then transfer to a train which would take them across the isthmus to Panama City. From there, they'd transfer to another ship and continue on their way to California. It was by no means an easy itinerary, but it was certainly much better than any other option out there. Construction on the railway would take over 5 years, and it would claim the lives of between 5,000 and 10,000 laborers. In the end, it would prove to be a huge commercial success, but very little of that money ever flowed to Panama. On the contrary, the railway was devastating to the local economy. The railway also brought scores of white Americans to the isthmus, and racial tensions rapidly escalated. Things came to a head in 1856 during the so-called watermelon incident. It started with something small. An American railway passenger, likely intoxicated, grabbed a watermelon slice from a street vendor's cart and then refused to pay for it. The argument between the two men evolved into a full-blown riot. In the end, 17 people lost their lives. This event prompted the United States government to take an extremely unprecedented step. They sent in the military to occupy the railway station, and they did this without permission from Bogota. You see, the United States treaty with Colombia contained a seemingly innocuous clause called Article 35. This clause obligated the United States to guarantee the, quote, perfect neutrality of the isthmus. Now, I fail to understand how they came up with this interpretation, but the United States asserted that this justified their use of military force. and it's going to come up again and again over the coming years. But before we can talk about that, we have to talk about something extraordinary that was happening on the other side of the world. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened for business, proving for the first time that such an audacious project was possible. The supposed mastermind of the Suez Canal was a Frenchman by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was kind of the Elon Musk of his time. Okay, that may not be a fair comparison, but hear me out. De Lesseps was revered as an innovative genius, a change agent, an entrepreneur who was only interested in pursuing ambitious and crazy projects with broad global impact. Sound familiar? His ideas were radical, and he was extremely good at raising money. And as it turns out, he was, in actuality, a complete, bumbling buffoon. Emboldened by his success with Suez, de Lesseps set about raising money for a new and even more ambitious project. Le Grand Français, as he was known, was going to build a canal to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through the Isthmus of Panama. His fame and natural charisma enabled him to raise millions from ordinary French citizens who invested their entire life savings in his canal company. But almost immediately, it became evident that the project was headed for disaster. A French engineer by the name of du Lepinay had come to de Lesseps with a very sensible plan for a lock and lake canal. The idea was to dam the Chagres River and create a massive man-made reservoir. The water from that lake could then be gravity-fed to refill a series of locks constructed on either end. Now, locks are just a way of raising or lowering ships between different water levels. A ship sails into the lock and a gate closes behind it. Water is then pumped from upstream until the water level equalizes. The gate in front of the ship opens and it sails on its merry way. De Lesseps heard this plan and thought it was asinine. Now, I should point out that de Lesseps was not an engineer, nor did he ever bother to visit Panama even once during the rainy season when the level of the Chagres would rise by as much as 10 feet. De Lesseps had built the Suez Canal without locks, and he had sold his investors on the same approach for Panama. He wasn't willing to change his mind. So his men got to work, building de Lesseps' vision, and it was a disaster. Every year during the rainy season, landslides would refill the canal, undoing the past year's work. De Lesseps would go back to his investors and raise just enough money to keep the project afloat. It became downright Sisyphean. Worse still, they underestimated the treacherous jungle. Venomous snakes and spiders killed thousands, and the worst killer of all was one nobody suspected. Years later, the American physician who led the effort to eradicate mosquito-borne illness in Panama would write that, probably, if the French had tried to propagate yellow fever, they could not have provided conditions better adapted to the purpose. In the span of just 8 years, the French Canal project claimed the lives of some 22,000 laborers, and there was little to show for their sacrifice. By 1889, de Lesseps could no longer conceal the dismal status of the project from the public. His last-ditch attempt at fundraising failed, and the Panama Canal Company declared bankruptcy. 800,000 investors lost everything. It would later come out that de Lesseps' company had been bribing elected officials. Some 510 members in total of the French Parliament had accepted bribes to conceal the finances of the company from the public, and to appropriate taxpayer funds to its bailout. In 1893, Ferdinand de Lesseps was convicted of corruption, but he would never end up serving any time in jail. A year later, in 1894, he died, a disgraced and penniless fraud. This may well have been the end of the story if it wasn't for a Frenchman by the name of Philippe Bunau-Varilla. Remember him? An outcome of the bankruptcy proceeding was the formation of a new company to manage the assets of the failed venture. Bunau-Varilla was kind of forced to invest in this new company, but he wasn't really that upset about it. You see, Bunau-Varilla was a true believer in the Panama Canal, and the lengths that he went to make sure that it was built were insane. He had come to Panama in 1882 to work for de Lesseps as an engineer. and by the project's end he had risen to the rank of general manager, just as the company collapsed. Nonetheless, he was a savvy guy, and he sensed an opportunity. They did try to restart engineering operations for a while, but he quickly began courting a new potential buyer. For years, the US had flirted with the idea of building a trans-Isthmian canal of their own, but in Nicaragua, where important legal hurdles had already been cleared. Undeterred, Bunau-Varilla hired a lobbyist named William Cromwell, and together they began a propaganda offensive. In one of many stunts, they planted a fake story in the New York Sun saying that a volcano had erupted in Nicaragua. It hadn't. They then followed this up by sending Nicaraguan postage stamps to senators. These seemed to depict a smoke cloud billowing from the summit of Mount Momotombo. Now, was it actually a smoke cloud, or was it just a normal cloud? In either case, Momotombo had in fact been dormant for hundreds of years and presented little threat to the project. But their lobbying activities were successful, and in 1902, the United States agreed to purchase the assets of Bunau-Varilla's syndicate for the sum of $40 million. But there was a catch, a big catch. Remember that at this time, Panama was still a part of Colombia. In order to build the canal, the United States would need to get permission from Bogota. And in 1903, negotiations fell apart. Bunau-Varilla's $40 million payout looked to be in jeopardy, so he did what anyone would do. He orchestrated a coup. Bunau-Varilla met in secret with an influential Panamanian separatist named Manuel Amador, and he made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. Bunau-Varilla was going to finance the Panamanian Revolution. He even went so far as to draft a constitution and design a flag for the new country, a flag design that was ultimately rejected. What's more, Bunau-Varilla convinced Amador that he had the full backing of the US government, which was not true at all. Nonetheless, Amador returned to Panama and started putting the plan in motion. He recruited local politicians to the cause and used Bunau-Varilla's money to bribe Colombian loyalists, including the head of the police force and members of the military. To rid themselves of the Colombian garrison, they falsified intelligence about an invasion plot by Nicaragua, but this backfired. Colombia dispatched a warship to Panama to figure out what was going on. The conspirators panicked. Amador sent an urgent wire to Bunau-Varilla asking for immediate support from the US military. But of course, Bunau-Varilla had no such authority. I cannot stress enough that he was a private citizen acting on his own accord. What he did have, however, were powerful friends. Shortly after receiving the wire from Amador, Bunau-Varilla reached out to Francis Loomis, the Assistant Secretary of State, and encouraged him to send a ship to Panama in advance of a possible uprising on the isthmus. Bunau-Varilla had already started laying the groundwork for this kind of thing a bit earlier. He'd arranged multiple meetings with Secretary of State John Hay as well as President Roosevelt himself. He advised them that a revolution was coming, and while he received no pledge of any kind of military support, there had been a lot of discussion about the need to keep transit open during such a tumultuous event. In light of this, Loomis agreed, and on November 2nd, the USS Nashville arrived in Cologne Harbor. The conspirators breathed a sigh of relief and went forward with their plot. When the Colombian force arrived in Cologne days later, the USS Nashville did nothing to stop them. Commander Hubbard was under orders just to inspect the situation and report back. He had no knowledge of the plot. Local dignitaries were there to greet the Colombian generals when they arrived, and they had cooked up a lie. They told the generals that they could go to Panama City via rail, but that the rest of their troops would have to remain behind due to technical issues, they claimed. When the generals arrived in Panama City, they were placed under arrest. Back in Cologne, the plotters told the acting commander about the general's arrest, and they attempted to bribe him to leave. But he became enraged and threatened to burn the city to the ground unless the generals were released. Fearing a violent conflict, Colonel Hubbard brought the Nashville into the wharf and landed some 40 Marines to protect the buildings of the Panama Railroad. In the end, the Colombian forces backed down. News of the insurrection made its way back to Roosevelt, and within hours, a dozen American gunboats were dispatched to guard both shores of the Panamanian Isthmus. 2 days later, a diplomatic cable arrived in Bogota. The people of Panama have, by apparently unanimous movement, dissolved their political connection with the Republic of Colombia. President Roosevelt holds that he is bound by treaty obligations to see that the peaceful traffic of the world across the Isthmus of Panama shall not longer be disturbed. That's right. According to the US, its treaty with Colombia justified the use of military force against Colombia. It kind of makes your head spin. At any rate, Colombia certainly wasn't going to go to war with the powerful United States, and so it seemed that Panama had effectively won its independence. Or had it? Let's backtrack to that meeting a few months earlier in New York between Bunau-Varilla and Manuel Amador. When Bunau-Varilla made his irresistible offer to finance the Panamanian Revolution, he did demand one thing in exchange. He wanted to be appointed Minister Plenipotentiary of Panama, effectively giving him the authority to negotiate treaties on Panama's behalf. This despite not being Panamanian or even living in Panama. The junta kept their end of the bargain, and on November 6th, he received his official appointment. Just 4 days later, on November 10th, he met with Secretary Hay to present a draft of a proposed canal treaty. Bunau-Varilla had written this draft himself, and it was extremely favorable to the US. Now, international diplomacy usually moves at a snail's pace, but a mere 8 days later, the parties reached an agreement, and the treaty was signed. Why the rush? Well, remember at the beginning of the video when I said that Amador was on his way? Well, he was, and he arrived mere hours after the treaty had already been signed. At that point, there was nothing he could do to stop it. So let's talk about this treaty. The Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, as it was called, established a 5-mile-wide region that spanned from one end of Panama to the other, known as the Canal Zone. The treaty granted the United States all the rights, power, and authority within the Canal Zone, effectively annexing it. In exchange, Panama would receive a meager payment of $10 million, and they would also receive annual rent payments, but these were only $250,000 a year. That's about 70 cents per acre. Talk about a bargain. The treaty was never signed by a single Panamanian. On February 23rd, the United States Senate voted to ratify the treaty after some intense debate about its fairness. Not its fairness to the United States, mind you, but rather about whether it was fair to the Panamanian people. After the vote passed, Bunau-Varilla resigned as Panama's minister, his work complete, and on May 2nd, the United States officially purchased the assets of his syndicate for $40 million. Bunau-Varilla finally got his payout. On May 4th, the US flag was raised over the Canal Zone, and construction officially started again.
These, however, are good old American shovels. They are working here just past the sheer face of Culebra at the lowest point of the cut, the very real bottom of the Panama Canal.
Initially, the American project looked to be headed for pretty much the same fate as the French project. It undoubtedly would have also failed if it weren't for a railroad man by the name of John Stevens. Stevens was a self-educated civil engineer who started out as a surveyor and quickly worked his way up to become the chief engineer for the Great Northern Railway, one of the most ambitious railroad projects ever attempted. In 1905, he was hired by Teddy Roosevelt to take over as chief engineer for the Panama Canal project, after the previous guy quit in frustration. Almost immediately, Stevens began to butt heads with the Isthmian Canal Commission, or ICC, which was effectively the board of directors for the project. Seemingly eager to repeat history's mistakes, the ICC had voted 5-8 in favor of building a sea-level canal. Stevens knew this was a bad decision. You see, he had the good sense to actually visit Panama during the rainy season, and he determined that a sea-level approach was, quote, an entirely untenable proposition. Stevens wanted to go with the lock and lake design put forth by de Lepinay years earlier, whereby the Chagres would be dammed to create a large artificial lake which could then be used to refill locks at either end of the canal. In his mind, this approach was sensible, and it was the only way that the canal could be built. So Stevens traveled to Washington to make his appeal directly to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt overruled the commission and sided with Stevens. He declared that the canal would be built using locks. This was a huge victory, but it wouldn't be the last battle that Stevens would fight with the ICC. A man named Colonel Gorgas had been hired as the project's sanitation officer. Basically, he was in charge of disease prevention on the isthmus. Gorgas was a man of science, and science sometimes leads people to unpopular conclusions. You see, Gorgas, like most, originally believed that yellow fever and malaria were caused by poor sanitation, basically that being surrounded by filth made people sick. While working in Havana, Gorgas had attempted to eradicate disease there with an aggressive cleanup effort, but nothing seemed to be working. Then, in 1901, he decided to test out a new theory. Could yellow fever and malaria be caused by mosquitoes? It was an idea that was ridiculed in the press, but Gorgas gradually became convinced that it had merit, and perhaps more importantly, he was desperate to find some way to stem the tide. So he and his team got to work eradicating the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which previous research suggested as a likely carrier. And it worked! Cases of yellow fever rapidly fell from 1,400 the previous year to just 37. By October of 1901, yellow fever had been completely eliminated. Now you would think that this kind of success would make believers out of just about anyone. But when Gorgas arrived in Panama in 1904, he was treated with hostility and ridicule by the ICC. But he found support in none other than John Stevens, who went head-to-head with the commission. Once again, Stevens got his way, and Gorgas got to work. The mosquito eradication effort in Panama was unprecedented in scale. 124,000 gallons of larvicide were sprayed, and 700,000 gallons of oil were poured on potential mosquito breeding grounds. Ponds and streams were filled with earth. Workers were strictly quarantined. The project's fumigation effort depleted the entire U.S. supply of sulfur. But by 1906, this extraordinary effort paid off. Just like in Havana, both yellow fever and malaria were all but eliminated, just in time for a presidential visit. In November of 1906, President Roosevelt paid a visit to Panama to inspect the progress of the canal project. Now, get this, no president had ever before left the country while in office. Roosevelt was the first, and he was beaten up in the press for it. But Roosevelt was determined to learn the truth about what was going on in Panama, and he pulled numerous stunts during his visit, including arriving hours early for his welcoming ceremony and sneaking out of a planned lunch to go and talk with patients at the hospital. Overall, Roosevelt was pleased with the progress Stevens had made, but there was no denying that significant challenges still lay ahead. As Stevens had told his men years earlier, there are 3 diseases on the isthmus: yellow fever, malaria, and cold feet. And the worst of these is cold feet. The most daunting task ahead of them was the excavation of the Calipra Cut. While the French had already removed some 14 million cubic meters of dirt, they had only succeeded in lowering the summit by about 5 meters. For Stevens' plan to work, they had another 33 meters to go, and they'd need to widen the valley by 540 meters. That's about a third of a mile. 27,000 metric tons of dynamite were used to blast their way through the mountain, but Stevens knew that their biggest challenge was not removing the dirt, but transporting it. Every day, 160 trainloads of dirt were hauled away. Trains ran around the clock on tracks that were literally under constant construction. Men were routinely run over by trains and crushed by heavy machinery. And the most dangerous jobs were typically given to black workers from the Caribbean, who were viewed as being far more expendable than white American workers. Workers with so-called high-skill jobs were paid in US gold dollars and received special gold rule privileges, while everyone else was paid in Panamanian silver. By official policy, black workers could not be hired onto the gold roll. They were instead forced to live in the crowded, poorly ventilated silver roll barracks. And when they inevitably got sick from pneumonia and tuberculosis, they'd have to go to the inferior Silver Roll hospitals. Because of these racist and inhumane policies, black workers would end up accounting for more than 2/3 of the 6,000 workers who died during the American Canal Project. We don't know the exact number, and in fact, we don't even know many of their names. Teddy Roosevelt is the guy who usually gets the credit for building the canal, but it's these workers who toiled and suffered and in many cases died who really deserve the credit. In fact, Teddy wasn't even president when the canal was finally finished, nor was his successor, William Howard Taft. In fact, the honor for opening the canal would first go to US President Woodrow Wilson. In 1913, in a glamorous publicity stunt, he detonated explosives in the Gamboa Dike via telegraph. This caused the Culebra Cut to flood and finally connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific for the first time. A year later, in 1914, the U.S. cargo ship SS Ancon would make the inaugural journey across the canal. It was a triumph for the United States, but understandably, many Panamanians continued to harbor resentment over the perceived theft of the canal zone. In the years that followed, tensions rapidly escalated. A significant number of U.S. citizens continued to live in the canal zone long after construction was complete. They and their descendants became known as Zonians, many of whom were born and raised in Panama but who were proud American citizens and never really made an effort to become integrated into the Panamanian culture. In the 1950s, Panamanian students began protesting in favor of returning the canal zone to Panama. This was met by increased militarization within the zone, which, as you can imagine, didn't help matters much. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy attempted to soothe tensions with a symbolic gesture. He ordered that the Panamanian flag should be flown alongside the American flag anywhere within the canal zone. But this backfired. The order infuriated many Zonians who protested by raising the U.S. flag anywhere that they could. One in particular would become a flashpoint. After a U.S. flag was raised at Balboa High School, located within the canal zone, Panamanian students from a neighboring school outside the zone marched in, Panamanian flags in hand. What began as a scuffle soon erupted into a full-out war between protesters and police. By the time the dust had settled, 28 people were dead, including a 19-year-old Panamanian student who was shot from behind. Following the Martyrs Day Riots, as they would become known, Panama suspended diplomatic relations with the United States to demand the renegotiation of the Canal Treaty. Negotiations with the Johnson administration resulted in the proposal of 3 new treaties to govern the canal, but each of these would fail to be ratified by Panama. International pressure continued to mount during the ambivalent Nixon years with no action really taken by the U.S., but in 1977, an agreement was finally reached.
This agreement is a symbol for the world of the mutual respect and cooperation among all our nations. Thank you very much for your help in this.
Under the terms of the new treaty, Panama would take over control of the canal zone and of canal operations by the end of the 21st century, following a gradual timetable. In December of 1999, the final phase of the treaty concluded, and a delegation of U.S. officials traveled to the Miraflores Locks for the ceremonial handover of the Panama Canal to Panama. Jimmy Carter himself had the honor of making the official proclamation, "It is yours." The story of Panama is far from over. Today, the country is thriving like never before. In 2021 alone, the Panama Canal generated more than $4 billion in toll revenue, and Panama now has the highest per capita income of any other country in Latin America. But was it all worth it? It's hard to imagine that a project like the Panama Canal will ever be attempted again. It takes an insane cast of characters like Teddy Roosevelt and Bunau-Varilla, but it also takes a complete disregard for the sanctity of human life and for the environment. I would like to think that we as people have moved past that. Maybe not. But what are your thoughts? What did you take away from the story of Panama? I would really love to hear from you. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you could please give the video a like and subscribe, I would appreciate that as well. Until next time, this has been Barrel Boy Travels.